In the picturesque suburb of Riverdale in southern Georgia, you can see well-maintained one-story houses and neatly trimmed lawns at every turn. The sun has just risen, and there is not a cloud in the sky, while the dew on the green grass sparkles like a scattering of precious stones. Despite the coolness of the Saturday morning, the air is gradually heating up, foreshadowing a hot day. A light breeze sways the branches of the trees from time to time, complementing the soft birds chirping. Meanwhile, in the courtyard of the Holy Ray Church, the bustle of business is in full swing. Some people are working on an arch of snow-white flowers, others are testing the sound of the equipment, and a few more are setting up long tables for an outdoor buffet. The Holy Ray Church itself is a small, neat building, whitewashed and decorated with bright stained glass windows. There are benches and flower beds with peonies and tulips scattered around it, which are now in full bloom. It is here that a special celebration is taking place today, the wedding ceremony of Tyrone Brooks and Ebony Williams. Family and friends have gathered to hear their solemn I do's, and everyone who has come feels boundless joy in their hearts. Meanwhile, a temporary stage is set up right at the entrance to the church. Pastor Terrence Fields, a tall and fit man in his 40s, appears on the stage, wearing an elegant dark suit. His parishioners highly value him for his sincere and inspiring sermons, and for never leaving them without support in times of need. Pastor Terrence takes to the pulpit and speaks succinctly yet insightfully about marriage as a sacred union, emphasizing the importance of taking care of each other in both good and bad times. Everyone holds their breath, listening intently. His voice is full of determination and inspiration. Tyrone, 32 years old, a short but sturdy young man, appears in a snow-white shirt and navy blue jacket. His heart is beating in his chest and excitement is evident in his eyes. He looks intently at Ebony, the 26-year-old girl who is about to become his wife. Her charming appearance is complemented by an elegant ivory dress, and she has a happy smile on her face, although she is trembling internally. We are gathered here to join these two hearts before God and before men. Pastor Terrence's voice comes through. His gaze and sincere smile are turned to Tyrone and Ebony, giving them a blessing for a happy family life. Holding hands, the newlyweds seem to forget about everything around them. Looking at each other, they say their vows of love and fidelity. It becomes noticeable how the excitement slowly fades away, giving way to a feeling of boundless happiness. The guests watching this moment burst into applause. Joyful shouts of "Congratulations!" are heard, and some, overwhelmed by the touching ceremony, quietly wipe away their tears. Celebrations and first suspicions. After the official part, a small buffet is organized in the churchyard. The table is overflowing with various delicacies, from canapes and fruits to sweet desserts. Light R&B tunes play in the background, and guests rush to take pictures, some with the newly married couple, others with Pastor Terrence, who is happy to pose with his congregation. Tyrone and Ebony are the center of attention. They radiate warmth and indescribable joy. Pastor Terrence takes the opportunity to come up again to congratulate the couple. "Tyrone, Ebony, you have set a wonderful example for all of us today. May God bless your marriage." He gently hugs Ebony in greeting, and she instantly smells the rich scent of his perfume, as well as his gaze, which seems to penetrate right into her soul. She shudders a little, but attributes it to the excitement and emotional arousal of the event. A friend of Tyrone's is standing nearby and notices that the pastor keeps his eyes on Ebony for several seconds before releasing her from his embrace. The friend quietly asks Tyrone, "Hey, does he always look at brides this closely?" Tyrone, filled with joy, just laughs and waves it off. "No, he's just a good mentor." Everyone takes it more as a joke. No one can imagine that this piercing look will be the beginning of a sinister story. So their wedding day comes to an end, with carefree smiles, kisses, and the certainty of a happy life together. Nothing foreshadows the horror that lies ahead. 2 weeks have passed since that moment. Tyrone and Ebony's life is slowly getting back to normal. The couple settles into a modest house near the church in Riverdale. Every morning, Tyrone puts on his work overalls and heads to the auto repair shop where he works as a mechanic, fixing engines, changing oil, and helping customers with advice. The work is not easy, but he is proud to be able to provide for his family. These days, Ebony stays at home more. He tidies up, goes shopping, and thinks about where he can apply himself as a volunteer. She has a lot of ideas, from organizing charity events to working with young people. And it's worth remembering that at the wedding, Pastor Terrence, noticing her energy, said, "Someone like you would be a great asset to our community." So now she is seriously thinking about getting more involved in church affairs. In the evening, the couple usually watches TV or discusses future steps, from plans for their own home to the children they want to have in a year or two. They fondly recall their honeymoon somewhere on the Florida coast, and everything seems to be going great for them. However, in between these idyllic dialogues, it becomes noticeable that a subtle tension is growing in Ebony's soul. She sinks into thoughtfulness when Tyrone talks about their future together. Sometimes it seems as if her thoughts are wandering off somewhere very far away. One Sunday after the service, Pastor Terrence asks Ebony to talk. Tyrone calmly returns home alone, not seeing it as a threat. Maybe she wants to help with the youth club, he thinks. It's great that my wife is so eager to be useful in the church community because I grew up in a devout family. Ebony shows up only 2 hours later, explaining that she and the pastor were planning a charity clothing sale. Tyrone doesn't see anything unnatural in this. He is happy to see his beloved's initiative. However, somewhere in the back of his mind, a vague anxiety is already creeping in, as if there is some kind of limit for which he has not yet found an explanation. A week later, it happens again. Ebony comes home at almost midnight and explains that she was going through boxes of stuff for needy families with the pastor. Tyrone smiles and says, "So much for volunteering," but his voice is distinctly wary. Since Ebony has become a bit irritable, any clarifying questions Tyrone asks, like, "Who else was in the church? Why were you so late?" are met with short answers. "It was more complicated than I thought." "Don't worry." Tyrone takes a step back, convincing himself that his wife needs her own space. Thus, a wall gradually forms between them. The couple communicates much less about future plans and laughs together less often. Outwardly, their family still seems strong, but the reader can already guess that this is only an external facade. Deep down, Ebony is probably harboring new aspirations or doubts, and Tyrone is feeling a quiet discontent that he can't quite explain. It is now that a subtle but profound conflict is brewing with no obvious manifestations, but with small hints of a great upheaval to come that they cannot even imagine. A few more weeks pass. In her conversations with Tyrone, Ebony repeatedly mentions Pastor Fields and his suggestions for community development. She often stays at the Holy Ray Church after parishioners' meetings, categorizing humanitarian aid or putting things away in the basement. It all sounds logical. There is a real shortage of volunteers, and Ebony is full of energy. One evening after a sermon on morals and values, Pastor Terrence asks Ebony to stay just for half an hour to talk about a sensitive topic that is affecting your marriage. He argues that as a clergyman, he can advise them on how a young couple can better build a family. Ebony is a little embarrassed, but at the same time she is impressed by his confident and charismatic manner. As the half-empty room gradually falls into silence, she notices an unusual excitement. "You know, I'm always willing to listen to your concerns," Terrence says, looking her in the eye. "Young wives have difficult periods in the beginning of marriage, and I can share my personal experience." At first it sounds quite casual. Ebony says that Tyrone is wonderful, but sometimes she lacks emotion, more attention. The pastor listens, nodding, and repeats himself from time to time. "I understand you're looking for warmth." His voice becomes gentle, and he tells a few of his own stories, saying that he once experienced similar difficulties when he was young. The next meeting, when Ebony again stays to work on the paperwork after the meeting, develops a little differently. Pastor Terrence allows himself to be more frank, though circumspect, with compliments like, "You have a special inspiring energy about you," he says, not looking away. "You have great potential and you radiate a light that you can feel around you." These words are flattering to Ebony, but at the same time they make her feel a little embarrassed, as if she is crossing a hidden line. But the pastor is still cautious, and his words can be explained as a simple encouragement in the faith. When they finally finish their work in the basement and walk up the stairs together, Pastor Terrence pauses for a few seconds, holding Ebony's shoulders. His attentive gaze and friendly smile make her heart beat faster. She also smiles slightly but then quickly looks away. "Good night," she says, and her cheeks turn slightly pink. "Good night, Sister Ebony," the pastor responds, but there is more to his voice than mere politeness. That night after returning home, Ebony can't sleep for a long time. She is overcome with shame at her own inner turmoil, but also with a sweet feeling of elation. Next to Terrence, she feels special again. But in the morning, she kisses Tyrone with a smile and tells him that she loves him as long as it does not contradict what is happening in her heart. However, the reader realizes that the seeds of betrayal are already germinating. Time passes, and the additional meetings become more frequent. Now Ebony returns home almost at midnight, sometimes around 10 or 11 p.m. At first, she explains this by various small things. She had to sort used clothes for the needy, or deliver food to the shelter, or suddenly the cleaning of the church premises was delayed. Tyrone comes home from work to find an empty house and an undercooked dinner. He leaves her a message, but there is no response until she shows up late at night. There is some shy embarrassment in her words. "I'm sorry, I completely lost track of time." This worries Tyrone. He hadn't thought of himself as jealous before, but now he has a lot of questions. One Wednesday night, he walks into the bedroom and sees Ebony instantly lock her phone. When he asks her, "Honey, who were you talking to?" she seems to brush it off. It was a sister from church, the head of the charity group, although there is a slight tremor in her voice. Later, when Tyrone's cousin Demetrius, who is also a member of Holy Ray, comes to the car repair shop where he works, an interesting detail is mentioned in passing. "Did you know that your wife stays with Pastor Terrence almost every day after the meetings? I've seen Ebony's car in the church parking lot several nights in a row." Tyrone feigns calm and explains, "Yeah, well, she's volunteering," but he already feels uneasy in his heart. He asks, "Do you know who else stays with her?" "I'm not sure, bro." Demetrius shrugs. "I've only seen her car the last few times." Of course, this phrase makes Tyrone anxious. He tries not to be dramatic, but he can see changes in Ebony's behavior that worry him more and more. The next evening, Tyrone asks a direct question. "You're not getting too close to the pastor, are you? I don't want you to be alone with him." His voice sounds anxious and a little jealous. Ebony reacts irritated. "Don't you trust me? Can't a priest guide me? He gives me spiritual support, helps me deal with my own hesitations." The argument erupts instantly. Tyrone is unable to clearly articulate his concerns because he has no concrete evidence, only scattered facts and suspicions. Ebony, on the other hand, denies everything and reproaches her husband for standing aside and not appreciating her desire to do good deeds. As a result, they fall asleep with their backs turned to each other, feeling resentful and unsaid. A few more days go by. Ebony is staying at Holy Ray more and more often after the meetings. Pastor Terrence shows confidence that it is only about supporting her volunteering and additional conversations about spiritual things. However, he stubbornly suggests that they meet in the basement instead of the main hall. A formal argument. "It's quieter here, no one disturbs you, you can sort things without rushing." Over time, Ebony gets used to these basement conversations. She feels that the term spiritual care is becoming more and more vague. Occasionally, after brief dialogues about her relationship with Tyrone, the pastor resorts to pleasant, even flattering words, and each time she notices the elusive line they both cross, she repeats to herself, "It's just emotional support. He's a minister. He can't mean any harm." But something tightens in her heart. One day, as Ebony moves down a narrow corridor in the basement with boxes in her hands, Fields comes over to take one of them, touching her shoulder lightly. His fingers linger for a moment, and his eyes are filled with a strange glint. "You are so merciful to those in need. I thank God that you are here to help," the pastor says in a tone of special tenderness. Ebony tries to remain calm, but she feels a warm wave of warmth in her soul. The pastor seems courageous, confident, and his every casual touch evokes a response in her that she has never felt before in the church. Suddenly, he leans closer, adding almost inaudibly, "You are extraordinary, Ebony." At this point, she looks away, her heart pounding. But when she looks back at the pastor, he suddenly, almost unexpectedly, touches her lips with his own, a small but stunning kiss. Ebony pulls away abruptly, her eyes reflecting embarrassment. "No, you can't do that," she says, her voice barely audible. Broken. "I'm sorry," the pastor whispers. "I just felt that you wanted it too. If I was wrong, forgive me." She silently tries to collect her thoughts, and then justifies herself to herself, repeating barely audibly, "He probably just confused spiritual intimacy with feelings." But the next time they meet face to face, the line between ordinary advice or friendly conversation and real intimacy becomes even more blurred. In order not to arouse Tyrone's suspicions, Ebony begins to come up with convincing explanations. "There's a big charity fair coming up, and we need to finalize the logistics and the list of participants. The pastor has decided to entrust me with a youth concert. It's a huge opportunity. I have a serious conversation with the Women's Council at church. I'll be back later." She carefully deletes all messages from Pastor Fields, and when he wants to say something, he uses either private messengers or hints like, "Bring some more napkins to the basement. We're going to be late tonight." Tyrone already has some suspicions, but no concrete evidence. Changes in Ebony's behavior are becoming more apparent. She is increasingly silent at dinner, or she may just stare off into the distance. When Tyrone wants to share stories from the car repair shop, she often nods formally, then hurries to the phone as if waiting for another church call. Her husband's suggestions that they go to the movies together or go to her parents' house for the weekend are met with excuses. "Oh, we have an event for the youth." Or, "The pastor asked me to deliver flyers to the neighborhood." At night, when Tyrone tries to be attentive and gentle, Ebony often says she is exhausted. It's as if she lacks a spark in her life, and all her thoughts revolve around church business. She avoids making eye contact with her husband, feeling overwhelmed by her own guilt. Eventually, Tyrone's patience runs out. He is offended. "Why is my wife always disappearing from the house and making up stories about concerts when I can see that she's really worried about something else?" He tries to talk calmly. "Where do you go all the time?" "I feel like a wall has grown between us." Ebony is furious at this question. "I'm doing something useful. Why aren't you happy? You're fixated on the fact that I came back half an hour late. It's unbearable." The quarrel heats up even more. "You're hiding something from me. You don't trust me. After all, I do everything for our community." After these words, Ebony leaves the house again, saying that she has an urgent call from the pastor. Tyrone is left alone with a lot of guesswork and a sense of anger. As soon as Tyrone enters the bedroom, he notices Ebony quickly silencing the phone by turning down the volume. He manages to see a phrase on the screen. "Meet me in the basement at 7:30 p.m. "I'll be waiting," she chattered on in an excited voice. "This is Suzanne, one of the sisters from our committee." But Tyrone senses in his heart that the sender doesn't seem to be a woman's name at all. Realizing that he may lose control of the situation, Tyrone decides not to accuse her directly, but rather to check it out himself. That evening, he pretends to get a night shift at a service station. "Imagine, they asked me to stay longer. A big repair came in. You don't mind, do you?" Ebony just nods, looking a little distracted, probably glad that her husband won't be home. Tyrone, on the other hand, waits until dusk to leave, but then quietly returns to the Holy Ray Church, parking his pickup in a quiet corner behind the building. As he sits there, he sees Ebony's car pull up quietly in the parking lot, and she quickly disappears inside, looking around for witnesses. Cautiously, he approaches the back entrance to the church. Night has almost covered the town. The lanterns give off a faint light, and there is not a single person around. Quietly, Tyrone moves around the walls, taking advantage of the shadows, his heart pounding with anxious anticipation. In other words, he has to see for himself if his suspicions about Pastor Terrence are correct. Soon he notices that the back door is left unlocked. His heart sinks in fear, but it's too late to back out. Holding his breath, he makes his way into the dark corridor, lit by dim bulbs that cast frightening shadows on the walls. Muffled voices can be heard somewhere downstairs, and Tyrone quietly heads that way. As he approaches the door leading to the basement, he listens and hears what sounds like a whisper or a hushed laugh. Cautiously, he opens it and peers into the semi-darkness. There, bent over, Ebony is giving the pastor oral fondling. It doesn't sound like a normal conversation. The moment seems to freeze until Tyrone's mind begins to realize that what he had doubted is now confirmed by cruel reality. And then he is overwhelmed by a boundless wave of anger. A picture of betrayal and humiliation appears in his mind. His blood seems to pulse in his temples, and his hands begin to tremble. At that moment, he sees Ebony and Pastor Terence completely indulging in forbidden passion. Everything in Tyrone's soul rages: despair, resentment, and fierce anger. Barely restraining himself, Tyrone jerkily opens the door. Ebony recoils in fear, and Pastor Terence is completely stunned. For a moment, everyone seems to freeze. It would seem that one could try to explain or apologize, but Tyrone's eyes are filled with uncontrollable rage. What are you? What are you doing?" He cries out in a stunned cry, and then his voice rises. "This is a sin. It's—" Terence, quickly adjusting his clothes, frantically searches for words. "Brother Tyrone, it was a misunderstanding." She was desperate. "You took it the wrong way." Ebony, sobbing, pleadingly says, "I'm sorry. I never imagined it would go this far." But Tyrone is no longer listening. A sound like a groan of despair escapes his chest, and he takes a swift step forward. Pastor Terence raises his hands as if to stop him or speak, but Tyrone punches him in the face with incredible force, and the pastor loses his balance and falls to one knee. Ebony shouts in desperation, "Stop, please!" But Tyrone doesn't seem to hear her voice anymore. Grabbing the pastor by the collar, he shouts, "You were supposed to be our spiritual director, but instead you destroyed our marriage. You defiled my wife." The pastor helplessly struggles, trying to get away. "Calm down. We will settle everything. It was just a temptation." Tyrone's gaze is frozen with something wild and unrestrained. On the floor not far from them is a microphone stand, a sturdy metal pipe. He grabs it and swings it over his head. Terence, realizing that everything is too serious, tries to run away, but Tyrone strikes him hard on the back. The pastor falls down, wheezing. Ebony pleads through her tears, "Stop! You're going to kill him!" However, Tyrone is in a state of black anger. When the mind refuses to accept fear or logic, he hits the pastor's ribs with the rack again and again, and blood spatters onto the boxes of clothes and the floor. Terence makes death rattles that soon subside. After making sure that the pastor is lying motionless on the floor, Ebony approaches, hoping to stop the man. "Stop, it's over. I think he's dead." Tyrone pushes her away sharply, and she hits a metal shelf, feeling severe pain in her arm and hearing the crack of a broken bone. Ebony falls to her knees screaming. Now the only sounds in the basement are Tyrone's ragged breathing and Ebony's moans. Pastor Terence lies in a pool of blood, motionless. Suddenly, Tyrone realizes what he has just done. "What have I done?" He freezes, as if returning to reality. Probably someone in the upstairs rooms of the church or in the houses nearby heard the frantic noise. They might have seen doors open and screams, so someone must have called 911 to report that something terrible was happening in the church building. A few minutes later, voices are heard in the hallway. "Police! Who's there?" Two officers, guns drawn, cautiously descend the stairs to the basement. The light of their flashlights reveals scattered boxes, bloody footprints, and Pastor Terence's body, motionless on the floor. Tyrone stands next to him, looking confused at the blood-stained metal rack he still clutches in his hand. His eyes are empty, his pupils dilated. Not far away, Ebony sits dejectedly, hunched over, somehow bandaging her broken arm or clutching it in her clothes, sobbing quietly. One policeman rushes over to Ebony, notices her injury, and calls an ambulance. The other loudly orders Tyrone, "Let go of the gun now." Tyrone slowly unclenches his fingers. His hands are covered in blood. The officer orders him to lie down on the floor and handcuffs him. A siren can be heard in the corridor. The medical team runs in, immediately assessing the situation. It turns out that the pastor is dead. He has no pulse, and his injuries are too serious. Ebony moans from the pain in her arm, embarrassment and fear intertwined in one nightmare. The medics give her an injection of painkillers and fix her injured limb to take her to the hospital. She looks at Tyrone with horror, despair, and guilt in her eyes. Meanwhile, the officers take the stunned Tyrone out of the basement. He does not resist, does not speak, as if he is between shock and complete emptiness. Outside, he is greeted by the flashing lights of police cars and frightened parishioners who have gathered around, unable to understand why Tyrone is handcuffed and the pastor is being carried out of the basement under mourning clothes. The news of the man who killed the pastor because he was caught cheating spreads throughout Riverdale in no time. The local press ran loud headlines like "Bloody Horror in Baptist Church Basement" and "Scandal in Religious Community." Everyone discusses the details and moves from gossip to gossip. Some blame the late pastor, claiming that he had previously allowed himself to be overly attentive to female parishioners. Others sympathize with Ebony, who was left with a broken arm and a tarnished reputation. And some call Tyrone a madman who had no right to take a life, no matter what the betrayal. Tyrone is taken into custody, and 2 months later, the trial begins. The prosecutor's office brings charges of aggravated premeditated murder, emphasizing excessive cruelty. Numerous fractures and fatal blows were found on the pastor's body. The defense lawyer insists that it was a crime of passion, committed in a state of passion after the shocking discovery of the betrayal. Ebony appears in court on crutches, with her arm bandaged, as a witness. Her eyes are full of tears. She admits to having an intimate relationship with the pastor, but calls it a fatal mistake, explaining that Terrence took advantage of her psychological vulnerability and she was unable to stop in time. The judge and the jury study the crime scene photos, expert medical reports, and police testimony. Everyone is stunned by the brutality of the way Tyrone finished off the pastor, even though he was virtually unable to resist. In the end, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder, finding that there was no premeditation, but also emphasizing the excessive aggression on the part of the defendant. The judge announces the sentence: 20 years in prison with no immediate possibility of parole. Quiet sighs and cries can be heard from Tyrone's relatives, and he seems indifferent, although he sometimes glances at Ebony. She stands there sobbing, realizing that it was her betrayal that led to the tragedy, the blood of which will never be washed away. Soon, Pastor Terrence's funeral service is held. Part of the congregation refuses to come because they are disappointed in his morals. The rest mourn him because they remember his good deeds, even though they recognize that he has terribly violated his duties as a spiritual leader. Ebony, left with a scar on her arm and a tortured soul, is almost alone. Some of the parishioners turn away from her, talking about the sinfulness of this affair, and there are those who blame the pastor more. But still, her husband is behind bars. The priest himself is dead, and life in Riverdale will never be the same as it was before the tragedy. Tyrone is serving his sentence in a state prison. In letters to his mother, he confesses, "I am sorry for letting my rage get the better of me. I had no right to kill. Even for treason, even if the pastor was a scoundrel, I am not God to take a life. However, now it is too late for repentance. The verdict has come into force. The case is closed. 3 human lives have been destroyed." Thus ends a story that began with a wedding idyll and a pastor's blessing, and descended into a brutal murder because of an affair that undermines a marriage from within. And it happened in a place where love, mutual support, and God's presence should have reigned. One paid with his life, and the other 2 were left with a shattered future.